I will then move on to the complementarities between the women, peace and security, gender equality, and R2P agendas, to pinpoint the common points where, you know, we add women to UN agendas, and what happens then, you know, when we try to incorporate women's experiences and perspectives. And that has been the case incrementally. Women have been added into the R2P framework at the UN. So this is where I look at the actual UN discourse. And I look at that, I assess R2P documents, I look at the annual reports of the Secretary General, I look at Security Council, Human Rights Council resolutions to identify those references to women and gender, and the context in which these references to women and gender appear alongside the responsibility to protect the context where they appear in this in UN documents that basically map out the official narrative of what R2P is at the UN. And third, I'll end with some lingering problems. Sure, the 2020 annual report of the Secretary General, the 12th annual report, is great. It created a perfect window of opportunity to incorporate gender into a trusted prevention R2P framework, but there are still some problems. And what are these? So first of all, why do we even need to look at gender and R2P together? Why does it matter? I think it's important to interrogate the extent of gendering norms in general, right? We talk about R2P as a global norm, because this represents one core element of the UN's commitment to ensuring the prevention of mass atrocities and protection from mass atrocities. And this becomes really important in a context of R2P, again, having suffered significantly from gender blindness. The 2020 annual report issued on this big 15th anniversary of the UN adoption of R2P was meant to address the significant limitation of R2P, the gender blindness. This is why I say it's really important that the office picked this theme for the anniversary report. And yes, it emerged as the most comprehensive UN document on R2P to date to explicitly link R2P and women, peace and security agendas and firmly recognize the gender impacts of atrocity crimes. One of the UN officials I interviewed for this research, for this article, he was really funny. He said, actually, there's so much women, peace and security in the R2P annual report of the Secretary General. It reads like a women, peace and security annual report. So yes, it is the most comprehensive representation of, you know, how should R2P really look like if it's taking gender into consideration. Okay, so the hope is that, of course, from everybody, all of us R2P advocates and supporters, and all of us wanting trusted prevention and the responsibility to protect to work, it's clear that this report, last year's report, becomes a reference point for what a gendered R2P agenda should look like in practice. And the hope is that it will trigger a reorientation, reconsideration of existing R2P policies as gender responsive in the future. So there are a lot of hopes. There were a lot of hopes last year about that, but of course last year was the year of COVID, so a lot of projects were placed on hold. the current political context, some structural limitations at the UN, and I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. So the lingering problems like the lack of gender-sensitive analysis, and some analytical tensions between the women peace and security community and how they regard R2P. So some of these analytical tensions between women peace and security and R2P communities have so far complicated a systematic application of a gender lens to the responsibility to protect framework, which in turn ultimately, I guess, points to the limits of a gender audit in a politically resistant climate. Right, so I'll start with the gender blindness critique. So the Jennifer Bond and Laurel Sherritt piece from 2006 early on is great. So if you're interested in this topic, I strongly suggest you read their article, their paper. It's quite long. So they came up with like the gender blindness problem of the responsibility to protect. So they say it obviously started with the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, the commission which released its responsibility to protect report in 2001. So the commission lacked gender expertise, and only one of the 12 commissioners that worked on the report was female, a former foreign minister of Canada. The gender imbalance was also really obvious in the Commission's advisory board. But also, if we look at the sources, about 2,000 sources the Commission listed in its database, only 7 of them explored gender and atrocities, and only 4 examined women and how women or gender-related issues affect international security. So that was a problem with the sources used as well. And if you have actually have the initial package, the R2P, which the Canadian government actually, they sent thousands and hundreds of thousands copies across the world to various countries, and a supplementary volume that came in this package with the R2P report. It's quite big, put together by Tom Weiss and Don Hubert, who Tom Weiss, his amazing work on humanitarian intervention and UN, and Don Hubert was with Foreign Affairs Canada and one of the key architects from the Canadian government, obviously, who sponsored the commission. It was the Canadian government initiative. Anyway, so if you skim through this huge volume, this problem is quite obvious, the sources they used. And the report itself reveals gender blindness significant in terms of not even considering gender. It mentioned, if you look for references to women just 3 times, but it wasn't in the context of recognizing women's contributions to conflict and post-conflict environments, or about women, or the need to include women in this environment, right? So it was just women as victims. Now, if we look at the adoption of R2P at the UN in 2005, in the 3 paragraphs, gender blindness continues. These short paragraphs, very short ones, 138 to 140, they embody the UN version of R2P. At the UN, do not address any gender considerations and don't include any references to women. But this is the most authoritative representation of R2P at the UN, as we know, this first General Assembly resolution on R2P. Right, if we look at the R2P agenda after the 2005 General Assembly resolution. If we look at annual UN Secretary General's reports on the topic, released every year since 2009. If we look at the other UN resolutions on R2P, the Security Council and Human Rights Council resolution referencing R2P up to the most recent ones, some of these reports and resolutions establish some linkages with gender and women participation in international peace and security. And I'm going to talk about it in a bit, but it was never explicit, and it was never in great detail, right? So there were references, there were some mentions, but not in a very elaborate manner. So despite the official narrative of R2P as it comes out from this successive annual reports on R2P, various resolutions, controversies, as we know, and you've discussed this week so far, surrounding the normative agenda of R2P at the UN remain. So some aspects related to R2P obviously remain, the R2P's meaning remain contested, and how it's applied to different countries remains contested again. And of course, the biggest wow moment came with after the NATO-led intervention in Libya in 2011, after Security Council Resolution 1973 authorized the use of force under Pillar 3, as you all know. Any consideration of gender or references to women were missing from this resolution that authorized action in line with R2P's third pillar. And that's not surprising, since every Security Council resolution that followed, including those referencing Pillar 1 of R2P, most of them, the state's responsibility to protect, no references to women's role at all or gender considerations. But gender has incrementally been integrated in successive annual reports. And the one problem, why we look at that, at the extent, the context, how they are discussed, is because we don't want, feminists are arguing, if you add women or gender consideration, we want to make sure these are not treated as adds-on, we want to make sure these are incorporated coherently into R2P implementation strategies, because otherwise, what's the point? So it is important to look at the context in which gender considerations and references to women are included in R2P documents at the UN. Why do we need to take a gender perspective? Why is this topic important? And again, feminists look at the significance of using gender not as a descriptive term or a technocratic tool, or because it's the right thing to do, it's sexy, or it sounds great. It's important to look at gender as an analytical tool, which operates as a form of power in specific contexts. And the gender perspective is important to also look at how other identity factors like ethnicity or race or class intersect with gender to affect the diversity of people, but especially of women's everyday lives. And another thing, before I go into the more details, another thing I think it's worth questioning particularly because this is the first session on an issue, focused on an issue. So far, you looked at, R2P and regional actors or civil society or specific case situation. But now we look at how R2P relates to women and gender. Well, something to consider again, R2P agenda has been, in fact, under much more scrutiny for its reference to gender. So a lot of criticism on the gender blindness, more so than some of the more established agendas of the UN, such as the protection of civilians or children in armed conflict. And I think you're going to talk about R2P and youth tomorrow. So it's going to be interesting to think about this issue, in particular, the level of scrutiny, perhaps when you discuss youth tomorrow versus, women and R2P today. But that's because of the gendered nature of the 4 crimes R2P covers. Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing all have a gendered impact. There's no doubt about it every time. And over the years, several annual reports of the UN Secretary General R2P recognize this. Genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity affect men and women and girls and boys differently. So that's from the annual report, the 2013 one. But at the same time, something else to consider, and I'm going to relate this to one of the problems for integrating gender more systematically into R2P at the UN, relates to the fact that none of the UN documents that map out the Women, Peace and Security agenda have explicitly mentioned the need for the responsibility to protect as a broader thematic agenda to engage with issues related to women, peace and security. And the Women, Peace and Security agenda, they've done that with respect to with respect to stronger thematic UN agendas, such as protection of civilians and children in armed conflict. So this is a problem because it's so far one-sided, right? From the R2P side to the Women, Peace and Security, but not from Women, Peace and Security towards engaging or acknowledging the need to engage with R2P as a broader framework for protection, as they've done with POC, the protection of civilians or children in armed conflict. So the official narrative of Women, Peace and Security at the UN, as seen in the UN Security Council resolutions on the topic, recognize the need for the United Nations as a whole to increase the attention to women, peace and security issues in all relevant thematic areas of work on its agenda. But the fact that the R2P has never been officially recognized as a relevant area of work or complementary thematic agenda in Women, Peace and Security document, and has not been included in similar mentions as a relevant thematic area of work is a problem. So if we look at R2P supporters, the R2P community obviously sees the need to integrate gender and women, peace and security, learn some of the valuable lessons from the Women, Peace and Security 20 years of implementation and gaps and challenges. But Women, Peace and Security supporters have yet to consider it as a part of a context where Women, Peace and Security and R2P operate really at the same level, which I think only highlights the urgency of this need to apply a gender lens to the R2P agenda at the UN. So what I did in the particular article suggested for today, I looked at references to women and gender, because in this UN reports and resolutions, because I regard them as following deliberations with civil society regarding R2P priorities, and you've covered the important role of civil society, or is it tomorrow with Simon? So they follow deliberations and debates among UN member states in the UN setting, and they collectively together, all these resolutions and reports reveal the reference point for states and civil society agreements and parameters of what R2P entails. So searching for specific mentions to women and gender in these documents and for the context, specific context where they appear in text, shows the evolution, I guess, shows how the interpretation and the importance assigned to issues related to gender and women in relation to R2P evolved. And also the degree of knowledge on how gender operates at various stages of R2P related prevention and protection efforts. So pretty much what it needs to do is to ensure that women are visible empirically. Women being inserted in the reality and what happens on the ground, women as agents, women as activists, in addition to women being the victims of violence or the poorest of the poor. And maybe what if you're interested in this and if you read the article assigned, you'll see some of the commonalities. I don't know if there's a point now to go over all these references. Perhaps I can talk a little bit about the complementarities between the women, peace and security, gender equality, and R2P agendas. We can start thinking about the most obvious ones. Both R2P and the women, peace and security are structured alongside pillars. So their respective pillar formulations provide the broader starting point for examining women's role in supporting prevention and protection efforts within their respective interlinked pillars. So you know about R2P's 3 pillars, women, peace and security's 4 core pillars. It all started with the famous resolution 1325 in 2000. Are also interdependent, just like R2P's 3 pillars, and include prevention, the prevention of armed conflict, women's participation in peace and security processes, the protection of women during times of war, and inclusive relief and the recovery. So these are the 4 pillars of women, peace and security. The protection pillar is the pillar that has received the most attention to date in both R2P and women, peace and security frameworks, which, as we expect, has to do with the fact that women are portrayed as victims, which in turn can reinforce stereotypes of women as vulnerable instead of women as able agents of change, which is the idea of incorporating women and gender into the R2P framework. What the great thing about learning from what the Women, Peace and Security agenda has done so far, and the efforts, really a lot of them on the part of civil society in this case, was to bring women to international fora to allow them to share their knowledge and their perspectives on the best ways to protect vulnerable populations based on women's experiences on the ground. So not just data analysis and micro policy, basically listening from the women what protection should look like. Women as security actors and agents of protection at all levels are really two important categories to be considered when we talk about atrocity prevention as part of the broader security sector efforts to protect. And there's a lot of data from Women, Peace and Security from UN Women showing that if women are employed in service delivery, like women as peacekeepers, which is what we mostly hear about, or women as police officers, and as highest policy influencers, that means that we get to see more gender responsive justice systems. So despite women remaining a distinct minority within UN peace operations, women as peacekeepers have been recognized as contributing to mission success because women basically improve accessibility, outreach to women from host communities, which then draws on local women's knowledge of protection strategies and women's knowledge on early warnings and what works in terms of, early warnings and protection. One other linkage between the 4 R2P crimes and systematic and widespread sexual and gender-based violence is the linkage between the two is one element that came up early in R2P formulations at the UN in the first annual report of the UN Secretary General, and was acknowledged in subsequent annual reports. So the linkage with gender-based violence has always been there. But the 12th annual report, so last year's annual report, has significantly augmented the specific linkage when stating really categorically that all the atrocity crimes in the responsibility to protect agenda have a gendered perspective and impact. The legal recognition of this comes in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, defining crimes against humanity as including acts of rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence. Acts which may constitute war crimes as well. So these are some of the elements, commonalities. There are other synergies, the focus on prevention for both the responsibility to protect and women, peace and security. And to be fair, the prevention was highlighted in the initial report of the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty as the most important dimension of the responsibility to protect, but of course not in a linkage with women. And prevention was obviously highlighted in the 2005 or Summit Outcome Document paragraphs, where preventative measures, including early warning capabilities, are referenced. Now, I'm trying to figure out what to cover next. Maybe I'll say a few words about the references in the 12th annual report on R2P last year's. So before that, gender considerations were mentioned, but not in a serious manner. Complementarities between the Women, Peace and Security and gender equality and the R2P agenda have been incorporated, but not really in a systematic manner, or to point to this is what taking into account gender should look like. The number of specific mentions in this reports prior to 2020 show that there was not enough knowledge on how gender operates at all stages, really, of R2P-related prevention. And that's important because it guides policy and it guides practices on R2P at the UN, and it draws attention basically to why it means to include, it is important to include gender considerations and the role of women as central to implementing R2P. I don't know at this point, I mean, maybe I should, how many of you managed to read the article on gendering R2P? No. Maybe one person, okay. Maybe two from three, okay. Because I'm trying to think whether to go over the specific guidelines in the third. You know what we'll do? We'll talk about some of the problems that, so basically what I'm saying, if you're interested in this topic, and if you're curious about a specific portrayal of women in this, I think it's path-breaking 12th annual report of the Secretary General on R2P, have a look at that, go over the references. It's very telling, as I started in the introduction with what the UN official from UN Women, how he described it as shockingly similar to an annual report on women, peace and security. So there's that much analysis and gender included as an analytical category in there. But I think what's going to be more important is to pause now and say, okay, so we have an amazing reference point. It created a fabulous window of opportunity to actually do gender, gender the responsibility to protect agenda, and yet the momentum was lost. We haven't seen what we wanted to see. Those of us who adopt or vote for a gendering R2P. Why has this been the case? And there's no secret. I'm going to look at 3 factors before I think I end, because that might be more helpful to get the overall context about what's going on. So despite this amazing effort of the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and R2P, there hasn't been sufficient follow-up. And actually, last time I talked about this with Karen when she was still in the office, it was the question of the office actually wanting to discuss, how do we take this forward? How do we engage more with UN Women? How do we make all this guidelines work at different sets of actors on the ground? So it would have been interesting actually to hear more on that. I know the special advisor on atrocity prevention, Alice Beridu, was looking into organizing a few meetings to discuss precisely this. How do we take this forward? So the first major challenge, so it's 3 challenges that are really preventing a systematic application of gender to the R2P framework. The first one is a politically resistant climate. The 2020 annual report tackles the gender blindness limitation head on. So it places gender at the center of R2P implementation. But the practice of a gendered R2P is lagging behind. It is very hard to come across examples where the gender dimension of atrocity crimes have been considered by states in references to R2P since the release of the 2020 Secretary General's report, if we look at what states have done. State level discussion and engagement in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, and the Human Rights Council have been disappointing because the recommendations have not been taken forward in any of the sites of reference to the R2P agenda. And it's actually the most unfortunate turn of events at the same time that 2020 was the first time member states have not debated the annual report of the Secretary General in the General Assembly, which takes place every year, which was due to changes triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. But also that, I mean, it's very telling that in the same sense that the resistant political climate, the state level barriers we've seen so far, are reflected in the formulation of the first ever thematic Human Rights Council resolution on R2P, entitled the 15th anniversary of the R2P. So that was adopted July 2020 after the annual report during this big 15th anniversary year of R2P, but it doesn't include any references to women or gender, despite this being precisely the focus of the 2020 anniversary report. And the reasoning is because states from the core group within the group of friends of R2P that worked really hard to get the human rights resolution on the table, they were really not interested in including such references. And the UN Women, as I mentioned earlier, they're not very keen on establishing direct linkages with R2P to the same extent as they do with the other big thematic agendas like protection of civilians and youth in armed conflict. And they were really busy in Geneva with their two other resolutions related to peace and security. And R2P itself seems to be a bit under threat in today's political climate, with the UN Security Council and other UN organs deeply divided over issues related to international security and protection in general, and all this raising nationalism around the world. At the same time, with states neglecting their global responsibilities, as we see in Syria, Myanmar, and everywhere.